Fanny Adams was an 8-year-old English girl who was unalived by a solicitor's clerk, Frederick Baker, in Alton, Hampshire in 1867. Her unaliving was extraordinarily brutal and caused a national outcry in the United Kingdom. Baker abducted Adams and took her to a hop garden near her home, where he unalived and dismembered her. Some parts of her body were never found. An investigation suggested that 2 small knives were used for the unaliving, but it was later ruled that they would have been insufficient to carry out the crime and that another weapon must have been used. Fanny Adams was born on the 30th of April 1859, and her family lived in Townhouse Lane on the northern side of Alton, a market town in Hampshire. The 1861 census showed that Fanny lived with her father and 5 siblings. The family was locally rooted. George Adams and his wife Anne, believed to have been Fanny's grandparents, lived next door. Fanny was described as a tall, comely, and intelligent girl. She appeared older than her actual age of 8 and was known locally for a lively and cheerful disposition. Her best friend, Minnie Warner, was the same age and lived next door in Townhouse Lane. Alton was renowned for its plentiful supply of hops, which led to many breweries opening in the town and making hop picking an integral part of its economy until the mid-20th century. To the northern end of Townhouse Lane lies Flood Meadow and the surrounding River Way, which sometimes flooded the area in times of heavy rain. A large hop garden was next to the meadow. Alton had previously seen no serious crime during the 19th century. The afternoon of the 24th of August 1867 was reported as fine, sunny and hot. Around this time, Fanny and her sister Lizzie and their friend Minnie asked Harriet Adams, the sister's mother, if she could go out to the nearby Flood Meadow. Having no objections and being pleased that the girls leave her while she was getting on with her housework, Harriet agreed. Fanny and the local children had often played in Flood Meadow, owing to its proximity to Townhouse Lane and the fact that there had been little crime in Alton within living memory. As the girls were walking towards Flood Meadow and into the hop garden, they met Frederick Baker, a 29-year-old solicitor's clerk. He wore a frock coat, light-coloured trousers and a tall hat. Baker had moved from his former home in Guildford to work and live in Alton about 12 months previously. He was employed by solicitor Mr. Clements, whose office was situated on Alton High Street, opposite the Swan Hotel, a hostelry which Baker frequented. Baker gave Minnie and Lizzie 3 halfpence to spend on sweets and Fanny another halfpenny. The girls had seen Baker before church meetings and were thus unconcerned about taking money from him. Baker then watched the girls run up and down the hollow, a lane leading to the nearby village of Sheldon, as they played and ate the blackberries he had picked for them. An hour later, Lizzie and Minnie decided that they had enough and opted to go home. Baker then approached Fanny and asked her to accompany him to Sheldon. Fanny refused, and then Baker abducted her and carried her into the nearby hop garden. Lizzie and Minnie ran back to Minnie's mother, Martha Warner, on Townhouse Lane. She ignored their story, so the girls played together, oblivious of Fanny's abduction. It was not until 5 p.m. that they went home for dinner. Mrs. Gardner, who also lived on Townhouse Lane, noticed Fanny's absence and asked the girls her whereabouts. The children relayed what had occurred earlier in the day and told Mrs. Gardner that Baker had taken Fanny away. Mrs. Gardner then relayed the information to Fanny's mother, Harriet, and the 2 women searched for her. They met with Baker after going only a short distance near a gate separating the hop garden from Flood Meadow. According to the Hampshire Chronicle, Mrs. Gardner asked Baker what he had done with the child. Baker assured her that he had often given them money to buy sweets. Mrs. Gardner replied, "I have a great mind to give you in charge of the police," to which Baker told her she could do what she liked. Baker's position in town as the solicitor's clerk initially deflected any suspicions the 2 women had. Both returned to their homes believing Fanny was still playing in one of the surrounding fields. Between 7 and 8 p.m, Fanny had still not returned home, prompting Harriet and a group of neighbours to search for the missing child. As the evening was setting, the group began to search the hollow with no success. In the nearby hop garden, however, labourer Thomas Gates, a Crimean War veteran who partook in the famous charge of the Light Brigade, found Fanny's head stuck on 2 hop poles whilst he was tending the crops. Her ear had been severed from the head, which had 2 large cuts from mouth to ear across the temple. Further investigation discovered the remains of the child. The head, arms and legs were separated from the torso. There were 3 incisions on the left side of her chest and a deep cut on the left arm dividing her muscles. Fanny's forearm was cut off at the elbow joint and her leg nearly severed at the hip joint, and her left foot cut off at the ankle point. Her right leg was torn from the torso, and the whole contents of her pelvis and chest were completely removed. 5 further incisions had been made on her liver. Her heart had been cut out and other parts of her were missing. Both of her eyes were cut out and found in nearby River Way. Overwhelmed with grief, Harriet collapsed on her way to inform her husband, George, who was playing cricket at the time. When George was told the details, he returned home and loaded his shotgun and set out to look for the culprit. But the neighbours stopped him and instead sat with him through the night. The next day, hundreds of people visited the Hop Garden to help collect Fanny's scattered remains. The police tried, unsuccessfully, to find the murder weapons, and they suspected that the small knives were used to commit the crime. Likely, the crowd of searchers had inadvertently trampled any clues on the ground. They did, however, recover all of Fanny's cut clothing scattered around the field, except for her hat. Most of her body parts were collected that day, but an arm, foot and intestines were not found until the next morning. One foot was still in a shoe, and still clutched in one hand were the 2 halfpence that Baker had given to Fanny. The breastbone was never found. Her remains were taken to the doctor's surgery located in Amory Street for a post-mortem to be carried out. The surgery was later converted into a public house, Ye Old Leathern Bottle, and is now a private residence. Her body parts were sewn together only yards away from her home. From there, Hampshire Constabulary officers took them to the local police station. A stone that still had flesh and hair sticking to it was handed in to the police as evidence, as they thought that it might have been the actual murder weapon. That evening, Police Superintendent William Shaney hurried from the police station to Flood Meadow, where he was met by several people who then led him to the leathern bottle. Upon arrival, the proprietor of the house handed Shaney a bundle labelled Portions of a Child, and with help of some of his officers, Shaney organised a search to trace the missing body parts. Hearing that Baker had been seen with the children before her disappearance, Shaney retraced his steps through the town and located his place of work. Arriving at the solicitor's office at 9 p.m, he found Baker still at work an hour later than usual. Baker protested, claiming his innocence despite being informed that he was the only suspect. Shaney had no alternative but to arrest Baker on suspicion of murder. By this time, a large and agitated crowd had gathered outside the solicitor's office, forcing the police to smuggle Baker out the back door for fear that the mob would kill him. When searched at the police station, Baker was found to have 2 unstained small knives. Spots of blood were observed on both wristbands of his shirt, and his trousers had been soaked to conceal the bloodstains. After being questioned about his appearance, Baker responded, "Well, I don't see a scratch or cut on my hands to account for the blood." Baker's conduct during this interrogation was described as cool and collected. Sometime after the arrest, Shaney backtracked to Baker's desk in the solicitor's office and discovered a diary among some legal papers. An entry had been made for Saturday the 24th of August 1867 which recorded, "The Chronicle reported that the Hop Garden had been cleared on the 21st of September but nothing connected to the murder had been found." It also added that Baker remained completely unfazed by the killing and did not exhibit any symptoms of insanity or remorse. Further confusion was added when Baker stated that he was intoxicated after seeing the children. All evidence and witnesses rejected his claim. Baker was transferred to Winchester Prison on the 19th of October. Subsequent investigations from Hampshire Constabulary continued until October 1867. Around this time, a young boy whose parents lived close to the Adams family came forward as an eyewitness. The boy testified that he saw Baker emerge from the Hop Garden at about 2 p.m. on the day that Franny was murdered, with his hands and clothes saturated with blood. Baker then reportedly stooped down to the river and calmly wiped himself with a handkerchief, after which he put a small knife and another unidentified object in his jacket pocket. The boy had relayed his story to his mother then, but she had not told anyone until she spoke out in a pub 2 months later. The police searched the whole area for 16 days, but no other weapons were found. Shaney requested an immediate forensic test in late October. All recovered clothing and the 2 knives taken from Baker at the time of his arrest were sent to Professor A.S. Taylor at Guy's Hospital in London, where they received the most detailed tests possible for the period. After examining the items over the coming weeks, Taylor was able to confirm that the blood on the knives was human. One of the knives contained a small amount of coagulated blood, although none was on the handle. In a cross-examination, Taylor stated that we would have expected more blood on the knives and signs of rust if they had been washed. The quantity of blood found, however, was surprisingly small. However, Taylor suggested that an inexperienced person armed with a proper weapon could dismember a body in about half an hour. Blood would still run, but would have not spurted from the body. Further examination of Baker's clothes uncovered small traces of diluted blood in some of his waistcoat, trousers and stockings. The wristbands of his shirt had been folded back, and there was found to be diluted bloodstains in the folds. There was no sign of sexual assault on the body. Dr. Lewis Leslie from Alton thought Fanny's ultimate cause of death was probably by a blow to the head with a stone. Leslie speculated that a large instrument had have been used to cut the body and also added that dismemberment was achieved in less than an hour. Forensics indicated that the cuts had been made when the body was still warm and that Fanny had not been cut, but also hacked and torn into pieces. The time it had taken Baker to cut the body into so many pieces most likely allowed him to choose his positioning so that he might not necessarily be covered in blood. The forensic staff in London concluded that the small knives found in Baker's possession would not have been capable of severing parts of Fanny's body, so another weapon would have been used. Meanwhile, in Winchester Prison, Baker was talkative to the wardens, especially the chaplain. He insisted that his conscience was clear concerning the murder and wondered who the guilty party was, hoping that he would be found. Baker ate and slept well, which was a contrast to his time in Alton's prison, where he was reportedly disturbed in his sleep and physically shuddered at the sight of meat. English law at the time required that in the case of sudden death, an immediate inquest had to be held under the jurisdiction of a coroner. In the case of Fanny Adams' inquest, Deputy County Coroner Robert Harfield was in charge of the proceedings, which were held at the Duke's Head Inn, later named the George, in Alton on the 27th of August 1867. Cheney and acting Chief Constable Superintendent Evatt, who represented Hampshire Constabulary, were in attendance. Coincidentally, the pub where the initial trials were held were very close to the police station, which is now the site of a fire station. The first to give evidence was Minnie Warner, who told the jury that Baker had given her money to run down to the hollow with Fanny and into a nearby field where he picked blackberries for them. She was unable to identify Baker but correctly described what he was wearing when he murdered Fanny. The next to testify was Fanny's mother, Harriet, who recalled that she met Baker at the gate to the hop garden where he was headed towards the road which led to Basingstoke. Minnie identified Baker as the man who gave her the pennies there. Baker contradicted Minnie by saying, "No, 3 halfpence." When Harriet asked him for his name, Baker refused but told her where he could be found. Mrs. Gardner, who had accompanied Harriet to search for the missing girl, gave evidence next. She was able to identify Baker and told the jury that he appeared to be very relaxed at the time she saw him. After asking him if she'd seen the missing child and inquiring why he'd given her money, Mrs. Gardner told Harriet that she should give him in charge to the police, adding, After being asked again about Fanny's whereabouts, Baker said that he had left her at the gate to play. The coroner asked Baker if he wanted to cross-question the witness, but he declined. The inquest concluded that Baker was responsible for the murder of Fanny Adams and he was committed to the Winchester Gaol to await trial. The trial took place at Winchester on the 5th of December. The defence contested Minnie's identification of Baker and claimed the knives found were too small for the crime. They also argued insanity. Baker's father had been violent, a cousin had been in asylums, and his sister had died of a brain fever and had attempted suicide after a love affair. The defence also argued that the diary entry was typical of the epileptic or formal way of entry, and that the absence of comma after the word did not render the entry a confession. Justice Miller invited the jury to consider a verdict of not responsible because of insanity, but they returned guilty verdict after just 15 minutes. On the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, Baker was hanged outside Winchester Prison. The crime had become notorious and a crowd of 5,000 people attended the execution. This was the last public execution held at that prison. Before his passing, Baker wrote to the Adams family expressing his sorrow for what he had done in an unguarded hour and seeking their forgiveness. Following his execution, Baker's mask was made, and the following year his full figure was placed in an exhibit in the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds' famous waxworks in London. Fanny was buried in Alton Cemetery. The headstone, erected by voluntary subscription, reads, In 1869, new rations of tinned mutton were introduced for British seamen. They were unimpressed by it and suggested that it might be the butchered remains of Fanny Adams. Fanny Adams became slang for mediocre mutton stew, scarce leftovers, and then anything worthless. The large tins the mutton were delivered in doubled as mess tins. These, or cooking pots, are still known as fannies. By the mid-20th century, many working-class men were pretending to their children and social superiors that their favourite expression, Sweet F.A., stood for Sweet Fanny Adams, with its commonplace meaning of total inaction or downtime, while they and their peers used that expression among themselves to mean Sweet F all. Sweet Fanny Adams has lingered as a euphemism for that expletive.